Hi, I'm Linda Augsburg, Executive Editor of American Patchwork and Quilting, and today on Show Me How, brought to you by Baby Lock, I'm going to show you how to make this cute star quilt. If you want to sew along with us, download the instructions from allpeoplequilt.com/showmehowquilt. The great part about this quilt is that there's just one pieced unit, the star points unit, and then you sew together some squares with that and you've got this adorable quilt. To make it, I chose 9 different fabrics for the stars and 9 different fabrics for the background. This is a great use for 10-inch pre-cut squares or 2.5-inch pre-cut strips, but in this case I just used my favorite fabrics. What you'll need to cut then is a 2.5-inch square of each of your star fabrics, 8 1.5-inch squares of each of your star fabric, and 8 2.5-inch squares of each of your background fabrics. In addition, you'll want to choose a border fabric and cut 2 2-inch strips across the width of fabric for your borders, and then for your binding, cut 3 2.5-inch strips across the width of the fabric. Of course, you'll need batting and backing, and then you're ready to go. So the first thing you're going to do is mark the diagonal line on your smaller 1.5-inch blocks. So I'm using a chalk pencil, but you can use a regular pencil. I just find on the darker fabric, a chalk pencil in this bright contrast pink really shows off for me. You're going to mark all 8 of the squares in the same way. So you can see I've got my 2.5-inch squares of the background fabric and my 1.5-inch squares of the star fabric. And I'm going to show you, you just want to position that in the corner and watch the placement of that line that you've made. You want to make sure it's going in the direction shown. You want to make sure you've got your lines pretty well, your edges pretty well lined up there. And I just put 1 pin in just to hold it in place, and then we're going to sew along that marked line. Alright, so you're just going to sew across that line, taking out the pin before you get to it, of course. And you can feed these in multiples at a time, so I can feed in the next one if I want to, and sew along those same lines, just using your regular stitch. So you can see I've chain pieced all 4 of my small squares onto my larger squares. And I'm just going to fold back then, flip that triangle back, and you'll see I'm not cutting yet. So I'm just going to press that with my fingers. Then I can trim these 2 off at 1/4 inch here. So you can see now I've trimmed that seam allowance and I've pressed it open. And now I'm going to put the second marked 1.5-inch square on top of our background square. And just put a pin in there to hold it. You want to make sure you've got the orientation of that diagonal line right, because what you're going to end up with is another flip on this side, the same as this one. We're going to sew on that marked line. Remembering not to sew over your pins as you go. Cut the thread. And just like before, now we've got our second square, we're going to fold that back and fold back our other pieces. And I'm going to press this down and then trim this seam allowance as well at 1/4 inch. Alright, so we've got our star point units pieced, and I've trimmed them up to make sure that they're 2.5 inches square. Then I'm going to lay them out. So I've got my 4 background squares in the corners, I've got my 1 star square in the center, and then I've got my 4 star point units facing that center square. I'm going to sew the rows together, 3 different rows, and I'm going to press those seam allowances toward the solid squares. So I've sewn the middle row to the bottom row, and now I'm going to sew the top row onto the middle row. To get the best results, I want to kind of wiggle these 2 seams together to make sure they're nice and nested together, and then pin the one that's going to be the one that I'm coming towards so that it stays in place. Again, on this side I'm going to do the same thing, making sure those 2 seam allowances nestle. And that's going to help me keep my corners where they meet, nice and square. So I've sewn all the blocks together. I've pressed the seams in these rows, in this outside row and this outside row, down, and I've pressed the seams in the inner row facing up. And that just lets me nestle these seams, the seam allowances as we go. Next, we're going to put on our borders. We've cut the borders at 2 strips, 2 inches by 18.5 inches, and 2 strips, 2 inches by 21.5 inches. Now I did measure my piece to make sure that this was right before I cut it. Even when we give you those border cutting instructions, it's always a good idea to make sure they fit your quilt. So we're going to sew on that border at 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I did pin at every seam allowance so that I can keep those seams going the direction I want them. It'll just help keep everything a little more flat. So you can see we got the borders on. Now you just need to quilt it with your batting and your backing, and then bind it with that 2.5 inch binding, and you're ready to go. Thanks so much for joining us on Show Me How, brought to you by Baby Lock.